Good evening. This is February, August 9th. I think it's the 9th. No, August 10th. I have a problem with timelines. And this is Stephanie Douglas and A View from Abroad. Tonight I'm going to talk about two things that I believe segue into each other. The first is about what a Paladin is and why Paladins have always intrigued me ever since the first Elizabeth Moon book I ever read. She's awesome. I'll get into that in a minute. And what is very immediate for people across the country, especially in the big cities, but for such a tiny island as PEI, we have a very, 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 very serious housing crisis. And I want to address that. The housing crisis, how I saw it coming, why it's here, and how can we collectively create the change, or actually, how can we collectively and with a critical voice have the government create the change that needs to be seen immediately. So I'm going to start off with Paladins. Now, the Urban Dictionary where is the Urban Dictionary? There it is. The Urban Dictionary defines Paladins as: the Paladin is a class of warrior that is fully devoted to kindness and ridding the universe of evil. They are very religious and have extremely strict honor code, as well as a soft spot for children and animals. In combat, a paladin with a cause is almost impossible to defeat. Well, I don't know that's not my favorite interpretation of Paladin. My favorite interpretation are based on the books of Elizabeth Moon, The Deeds of Paxenarian. And I've been reading her books since the very first one came out, Sheep Farmer's Daughter. And her whole concept of Paladin that I have, over the decades, completely embraced in my head, but also feel it experientially. So her concept of Paladin definitely is that of a warrior, and it's a warrior who fights for good, fights against evil, protects the innocent, protects the vulnerable, and takes huge personal risks and even death in order to do so. Now, the Deeds of Paxenarian, and then she came out, which I was so glad she came out 25 years later, actually, I think it is, with her second series related to the Deeds of Paxenarian, but where she took the different characters that were strong in the first three books and gave them their own stories, but those stories were also interlinked. So the Deeds of Paxenarian and how she touched people's lives and how that reverberated over years was fascinating to read. Anybody who has I've read a lot of Elizabeth Moon's science fiction, but I think her most brilliant writing were the Deeds of Paxenarian. And I encourage anyone who likes fantasy to read her books, especially to read that series and the follow-up one. What I liked about her books in 1988, I believe 89, when I first started reading them, was that she has a background in being in the army, and because of that, a lot of her war scenes and setting up camps and are very realistic. Because when I read a lot of fantasy, I always go, where do these guys poop? And when do they eat? And how do they deal with those really basic issues? Because a lot of fantasy writers just kind of don't include that stuff. A lot of fantasy movies also, you see people go for days and days and days. They've never gone to the bathroom and they've never eaten. You don't see them eating anything. And I always go, by not doing that, it doesn't give me a time frame for how long they've been awake doing what they're doing. And if they're human, how do they get along without going to the bathroom and eating? So Elizabeth Moon does talk about, digging the jacks. That's where they go to the bathroom, deep trenches, um, walking in the rain, food, and it's because she has a military background. The other thing about Elizabeth Moon that was fascinating to me in the late 80s and early 90s, and still, is that while there are men and women in her stories, there are not gender issues particularly. So the men and women are seen as having equal value, equal voice, equal power. And that, for that time, I thought was phenomenal. I have not met very many people over the decades who have read her book, her trilogy, and very few men. However, I think men will like it as much as women, although the central character is a woman, Paxnarian. There are also a lot of other central characters to the story that are men, elves, dwarves, gnomes. It's diverse, and I love that. So for Paxnarian, for the Paladin, for Paxnarian specifically, because the Paladins were chosen at this Hall of Finpanir after doing lots and lots of education. But Paxnarian, excuse me, I'm going to drink some water. And of course, I'm going to light a cigarette because that's just me and that's how I roll. So, Paxnarian always wanted to be a warrior and a warrior for good. And she had to start out somewhere. Now, I'm not going to give the whole books away, but things had become systemized, so to speak. So where once the gods used to directly pick paladins, humans took over that job. And the story of Paxnarian follows her learning about the fact that the power actually always resided within her. And it was a long journey. And she suffered a lot. And she was beaten and beggared and broken and damaged and destroyed in so many ways. And yet, she came back from that. But by having been in that place, that fear that everyday people have, that she had always been protected from by being part of an army, by being part of the Paladins, by being a part of something greater, and therefore kind of insulated until she had her tragedies. When she became a Paladin, she understood the average person. The average person that walks around a lot of the time in fear. Fear of job loss, fear of whatever kind of fears that you can imagine. Fears of people with more power, all the different fears. That regardless of who we are and where we're at, the darker we are, Indigenous, the more indigenous we are or look, the poorer we are, the younger we are, or the very older we are. We have different fears than people with money and power and position. And so her trials and tribulations made her a warrior healer because she understood the basics of fear and pain. And by having that insight, by being able to relate to the very poor, the poor, and the average person, she was able to have a certain amount of compassion, kindness, and to really understand what it meant to fight for rights. And so that definition of Paladin, the warrior healer, because I believe the two are or should be intrinsically intertwined. Warrior healer. How can you be a warrior without knowing something about healing? But how can you be a healer without the ability and the passion to protect those who are the most vulnerable? So that's my concept of Paladin, the warrior healer. Um, and how this relates to housing is kind of bizarre. But it relates to housing, in my mind, because the people who determine housing and income assistance and all those things, regardless of where they may or may not have begun, if they're a premier, if they're a minister, if they're a deputy minister, if they're the communications experts, if they're the media experts, all of those different roles that at the ministerial level and the ministers themselves, it means that they have left that place of fear and need and want, if they ever had it, far, far behind, and are no longer in touch with the reality of what the average person faces, the insecurity they face around housing and food, especially in today's PEI market. So how did we get to this place? Because from 1995 to 2001, when I first came here, housing was not a huge issue. It was reasonable rents, food was reasonable, a little bit higher than Vancouver, but still reasonable. It wasn't that hard to find a decent apartment to rent for a decent amount of money. It wasn't hard to find a decent home to buy at a reasonable amount of money, considering the low wages on PEI and the seasonal work. But when I came back in 2013, water break. When I came back in 2013, I could, even though I was not healthy and really messed up and all sorts of other things that I won't go into in this podcast, I could see where PI was going with the housing. And I wrote really long Facebooks, articles, posts, whatever you want to call them. I tried to engage the different people I know from not-for-profit organizations. And I know through quiet feedback that a lot of the people I know in different nonprofit organizations have had conversations behind closed doors with ministers and other people in power about the growing issue. However, when voices are heard behind closed doors, then they're easy to dismiss, and they are dismissed. And people are silent about a lot of things because, of course, a lot of them get their funding from government and therefore are basically government employees. And it's like, don't rock the boat, baby, baby, don't rock the boat. I can't sing very well, but it really is about don't rock the boat, for fear. Security, security of home, security of job, security of money breeds fundamental insecurity. The more we have as humans, the more silent we become in order to protect it. Unless you're way above the lower middle, or upper middle class, unless you have a lot of money and a lot of power because of your money and position, people like that, they're not afraid of losing their jobs. However, and unfortunately, a lot of people like that are the ones who make money off of the poor and the tragedy of others. So, what did I see that I tried to communicate to friends, community members, anybody who would listen about the housing crisis that was coming, which I predicted 5 years ago? I mean, it was a no-brainer as far as was concerned. It's the same issues of housing and why there's a housing crisis that Canada has faced ever since I moved here in 1979, where the push was for both um, population growth and economic growth, but with no structures in mind, with no basic infrastructures already planned. Greed really takes over people's brains. So the housing crisis I've seen, Victoria, Nanaimo, Qualicum, even Salt Spring Island is not what it used to be. Vancouver, Burnaby, Surrey, Maple Ridge, Mission, Penticton, Kamloops. Kamloops, they just raised so many of the wine orchards to build on. Kelowna, Vernon, Calgary, Edmonton, like you name it, Halifax, Dartmouth, across the country, it's been a similar path. And the path that I saw in 2013, 2014, and ever since, is one based primarily on greed. So they say it's about raising the standard of living on the island, but quantity doesn't always mean quality. PEI had something uniquely special about it, about caring for each other and protecting each other and um, caring more for the person's integrity and value than how big their house was and how much money they made. It was so refreshing after coming from Vancouver. But the government, the provincial government, especially the new provincial government, and the university and the college have been making this huge push, and the city, let's not forget the city, has been making this huge push to become a point of entry for immigrants and refugees, to recruit heavily foreign students because they're cash cows. Every year the city says foreign students bring in blah blah millions of dollars into the PEI community. But that's a problem because there has been so much unchecked and unconsidered foreign investment in property and in land, no caps, and no foresight whatsoever in terms of, okay, every foreign investor who builds, and foreign investor could be someone from Vancouver or someone from China. When I say foreign investor, I mean someone who's not from PEI, where it's not their primary business and where it's just about making money. So when they started, when they started recruiting and going on trade missions and all that kind of stuff for foreign investors, the first thing that people usually invest in is property and land. Because if you own property and land, you can build high-end apartments and you can convert it into mixed high-end retail and condos. But what the city never did and what the province never did, especially the city, we have Clifford Lee and his cronies to thank for that, is that they didn't look into the future. They were just lining their pockets. So they didn't go, maybe we should do some research and look what not to do as we grow PEI and Charlottetown. Sort of like what not to wear, but what not to do. What are the best practices? How can we avoid the social issues that other cities and provinces have faced heavily by not putting in certain demands, certain infrastructures, certain rules around foreign investment in property and land, Airbnbs. No, they didn't do that. So what should have happened, which didn't happen, is that any new building, any new reno, eviction, apartments should have had a certain percent. It should have been mandated that any apartment building, any renovated building had to have a certain percentage of affordable housing. So below the market rate, the inflated for no other reason than people can make money and line their pockets and not care about community. The inflated rent rates, that in the last 2 years have gone astronomical. They didn't do that. In fact, Clifford Lee and Council and Holland College thought it was a really good idea to, in a market where there wasn't enough affordable housing already, to raise down a whole bunch of businesses and a whole bunch of affordable apartments so that they could expand and make more money. Airbnbs. There has been problems across the country in cities that went crazy with the Airbnbs and didn't put in any type of control or structure, or what's the word I'm looking for? No vision, no forethought. And yet Charlottetown and PEI could have learned from the other cities and other towns where Airbnb became a huge issue, where people were being turned out of their apartments. Some people had lived in the same apartment for 20, 30 years and were being turned out because, hey, the owners could make a fast buck all year round. But PEI chose, and Charlottetown chose, and especially Clifford Lee chose, not to look at the problems across the country, not to go, we can avoid this, They went, yay, money, line my pocket, line your pocket. Let's do some more patronage and special considerations and move these, um, move all the paperwork forward as fast as possible so that, well, we'll all make money, which isn't true. A few make money. So Airbnbs, like my couchmate who um, lost her apartment. She's living with me because she's homeless. Because when her landlord died, his son went, I can make a mint, and evicted everybody so that he could turn all the units into Airbnb. Now, the government could have and should have, and the municipal government could have and should have learned from the disasters in other communities and gone, okay, if you have a 6 apartment building, you have to keep 2 units as affordable units, not Airbnb. So none of these pieces, none of them were put in place. So there is no thought, no best practices, no learning from other provinces. So as more foreign investment made new condos, new buildings, um, Airbnbs, our affordable housing went down the drain because there's no checks on rents of new places. There's no caps of what people can charge for rent. So, the when the new apartment building next door goes up and they're charging 1,500 to 2,000 for a 2 bedroom, then the landlord with the crack house across the way or the person who has rents room goes, wow, if they can charge that much for an apartment, well, I can just change this room and say it's a bachelor suite. I saw a lot of those when I was looking for housing, and charge $500-$600. And in 2014, when I was homeless and looking for a place to live after getting out of the hospital, I already saw a lot of places that were smaller than any bachelor suite I'd ever seen because they were essentially rooms that had a hot plate installed and a shower installed and a sink of fridge installed and called a bachelor suite. And they were going for anywhere from $550 to $650. And I went, this is crazy. This is PEI. In 1995, I rented a whole half of a duplex for $550. And in 2001, I was renting a room central to everywhere while I was going to UPI for $375 a month, including utilities, Wi-Fi. And here the same kind of places, even worse, were going for $600-$700. So that is why that is in part a huge reason why we have a housing crisis. Now, add on to that the still horrific, useless PNP program where people come, they open a crappy business that they have no intention of ever keeping. They don't care. They hire young Canadian white girls to manage the business and pay them almost no money. And they don't fix it up because all they want to do is satisfy the government's requirement to own a business for a year to get their money back so they could get the hell out of PEI. And in where I live off University Avenue, close to the Royal Bank and Sobeys and that whole area, In the last 4 years, I have seen 8 or 9 P&P shops open and close. But that's more people, they have to be housed. Then you get the university, who is actively recruiting foreign students, cash cows. But all those foreign students also need housing. And we have a huge influx of Nigerian and Ghanaian students, as well as Asian students and Southeast Asian students. And rather than charging students reasonable rates for housing, which I've never understood, landlords actually charge students higher. And so, because they think, well, if they're for international students, they come from money, which is not true. Not all of them do. Some of them come and struggle and work 2 or 3 jobs, pay high rent, or live 5 to a 2-bedroom apartment just to be able to go to school. But all that influx of foreign students means no housing, especially when it comes to July, and foreign students are coming here looking for places to live for the school years. So both Holland College and UPI have very actively recruited and continue to recruit foreign students. And in the meantime, the city has chosen not to develop housing to meet a growing housing crisis, or the province. Their housing strategy has come out a little bit too late. And I have the whole housing strategy. I haven't read through all of it because the first page of the housing strategy terrified me. Because not only is the province committed to increasing the population to 160,000 people, they are actively recruiting islanders who are working away. So we already have a housing crisis, and they're committed to actively increasing the population through bringing home islanders who are working in other provinces, through actively being a gateway to refugees and immigrants, and through actively recruiting as many foreign students as possible. But there's no infrastructure. And so, for the first time that I know of, PEI is facing this very serious situation, and that is homelessness. Not the homelessness of the 90s or 2000s, when most of us knew all 6 or 7 homeless people on the street by name. And most of them were really older, except one person who had schizophrenia. And we no longer have the same situation for youth as there used to be, where if youth were having a hard time with their families, they could basically couch surf across the island. So there was a homeless issue with youth back from 95 to 2001, but it was a hidden, and there was reports back then, I'm sure they still exist now on some dusty shelf, but they were couch surfing or with friends, with the family of friends. And there was issues of seniors. But now with the increase in population from different parts of Canada, from different parts of the world, we have people on the island who have no family. They have no extended family. They have some community, but it's work to keep developing those community resources and friendships when you're from a different place, but especially if you're black, brown, or indigenous. Any person of color has a harder time developing those deep relationships with islanders or anybody in like Halifax, the same thing. Simply like the East Coast is kind of like that in general, because the East Coast, because of the weather and the have not attitude, people are very close knit. They tend to grow up with their friends and friends from school and their cousins and their uncles, and that's not a bad thing. It's just the way it's been because of the geography, because of the isolation, because of the historical lack of money. It simply makes it harder from people who are not from here, especially the more exotic and less understood they are, become very integrated in the community. So a lot of these people do not have family or extended family. They have no one to turn to if they're homeless. And because of the housing crisis and the zero um, number of housing units, we have a new type of homelessness on PEI that I never in a million years saw coming. And that is not the 5, 7, 8 people, older people who you know all their names. We have women and children, families who are now homeless because of being reno evicted or because building their units got a little renovation and then the prices got jacked up, or because they moved back to PI because of the recruitment of people move back to PI, this is your island kind of thing, and not being able to find affordable housing. And so and that creates another problem because there's a disconnect between the city, the provincial government, income assistance, and social workers. So we have people who, through no fault of their own, but because of outside forces and decisions by governments, are out on the street or living in their cars or tenting it. So social service finds out and they go, oh, this is not the right environment for a child. So there goes the child or children. And then the government, instead of giving the money to the family who can't afford rent, they pay foster care parents a lot more money. In BC, in 2004, it's like $1,500 a month, and it depended on, the age and behaviors of the child. But if you have 2 or 3 foster care children, that's a pretty good, on top of your husband or wife's regular income. That's pretty, it's a chunk of money. And the insanity is if even a quarter of that money was going to the people who needed it to pay for housing, their kids would not be in foster care. A lot of kids would not be. But when you have no food in the house, you have no resources, you can't afford the rent. If you buy groceries, you can't afford to do coin-op laundry. So the stress, the anxiety, the whole gamut becomes so unsupportable that, yeah, family breakdowns happen where there is no need for the family breakdown. And I know this from firsthand experience from working in child protection in Vancouver. and seeing the insanity of the disconnect by having income assistance and child protection completely separate. So BC used to have them together, and then they separated them. Which is what PEI has done. And so an example of the insanity is I worked with this family, this mother, Filipino mother of 3, who had serious health issues, who needed to go in for surgery. Her oldest child was 12 and therefore legally able to be on his own. And social services found her a job that was imminently so wrong for her because she had serious physical issues, and it was working as a stock person in a store. So she had to be there by 6 o'clock in the morning, and she didn't get home till sometime, especially with traffic, because it was out of town, till 6 o'clock in the evening. So the 12-year-old, the school was literally directly across the field from their house. Like, from their house, you could see the school. So her oldest son would help get the younger 2 kids ready for school, walk them to school, walk them back after school, and make them a snack till their mom came home. So she shouldn't have been doing the job because she was so sick. But then you have this crazy. I was their family counselor. I was the person who was there to assess the situation and make recommendations on whether the children needed to be taken away or what kind of supports. And I would work with the family for 6 to 9 months to help them access whatever they needed and to satisfy the social workers' needs so that the children were not taken away. So I met with this social worker who was talking about removing the kids because the oldest one was taking on the responsibility of getting the kids to school and home after school ended. And she was seriously talking about taking the kids away. And I looked at her, this very young, very tall, very blonde, very privileged, very unexperienced young woman who did not get it at all. I had to not only talk to her, but write to her and write to her supervisor about the insanity of social services or income assistance forcing her to get a job, regardless of the 3 kids and her ill health. They found her that particular job, and because they found it for her, she had to take it, because if she didn't take it, they said they would cut off her income assistance. And then the social worker going, well, because of the parent is working and because she's away so much from the home, the children aren't safe, we need to take the children away. And I'm going, do you guys ever talk to each other? Like, she's totally fucked. If she doesn't work, you guys will take her off income assistance and she'll be on the street with 3 kids, woohoo, and you'll take the kids away. But if she does work, you're going to take the kids away because she's working and she's not there. That's what PEI is like now. Things are separate. They're not together, so there's no real comprehension from one side to the other of having to work, having to find housing, having children, and because I find, just in the 5 years I've been here, that departments that are even housed in the same, not just the same building, but in the same office space, don't necessarily know what the other one is doing. And that is from very personal experience, which I'm not going to go into now. So what else happens when we have a housing crisis? Well, the housing crisis that Clifford Lee and his cronies definitely are the main culprits in why we're at this place. So what happens? Well, if we look at every other city in the country that has a housing problem because of growth that was too fast with no controls and no infrastructure, what comes with that is drugs, a lot more access to drugs. Let's face it, if you're sitting on the street dealing with the contempt and the spit and the judgment of every person who walks by, who would not want to be oblivious? I sure would. I would go for tequila than drugs, though I don't do drugs. Except cigarettes. So, you have a bigger influx of drugs because drug dealers know when you're desperate and starving and have no home that you want that, and you have no family and nobody's cares whether you're alive or dead, um, that they're very vulnerable and very easy to convince to buy drugs. On top of that, then you have, which Canada does not like to talk about or recognize, but which exists across the country, including PEI, including Newfoundland, definitely Halifax and Nova Scotia, is child trafficking. You get more rich people, and it's very hidden on PEI, so the average person doesn't even think it exists. But when you get a lot of very wealthy people with a lot of money and questionable tastes, you get increased child trafficking and you get increased sex workers. And because it's hidden on PI, they don't even have some form of protection by the community being aware of them. You think I'm joking. In the 90s, Halifax was the worst place in the country for child trafficking. And they would, you can look this up, Google it, child trafficking Halifax, 1990s. Um, there was tons of stories in BC on it. It was on the news nightly about people from Halifax, mostly men, but sometimes women, coming to Vancouver and snatching kids off the street who were already working the street because they had no resources and no supports from the government, and hooking them on drugs or drugging them outright and transporting them to Halifax. So child trafficking increases, and so does sex workers and their clientele. That increases. It's more dangerous on PEI because it's so hidden. But PEI already has a higher rate of violence than it did even 5 years ago. And with the homelessness, you get even higher rates of violence and higher rates of family violence and higher rates of suicide. So it'd be very interesting. I've talked to a couple of people. Nobody has been very forthcoming with the information yet. But I really want to know the correlation between, first of all, this summer, heat stroke and death of people on the street, of the homeless. Because there's no water fountains downtown. As far as I know, nobody's been giving out water. People will put out water for the dogs for free, but if a homeless person goes in and asks for a glass of water, they get charged for the glass or outright told, leave the premises, we don't want you. So, how many people have been hospitalized this summer in our heat wave for heat stroke who are homeless? How many suicides are correlated with the lack of housing? What is the rate of children being taken away from families because of the lack of adequate housing? Like, what are these rates compared to the averages over the last 10 years and to the average over the last 5 years? Those are the questions that the media here should be asking and should be finding out and should be talking about. I haven't heard them give any real information about any of this. So those are interesting things to think about if you haven't thought about them before. Well, is the rate of suicide among people with on income assistance or no housing higher than the PEI average? I'm going to bet that it is, without even knowing the percentages. Is family violence higher because of no housing than it was in the 5 years preceding? I'm going to bet that it is. The rate of children being taken away from families because of inadequate housing, are the rates higher than they were 5, 10 years ago? I'm going to bet that it is. So along with this bongdoogle, this fiasco, this insanity, this unwarranted, unnecessary situation, which the province and the municipal council and Clifford Lee should have investigated and prepared so that there would not be the issues today. They should have learned from everybody else's past mistakes rather than repeating them. Because once you have this situation, it is very, very, very hard to stop. You can forestall the situation of homelessness, increase crime, increase violence, increase drugs, increase children being removed from families, increase child trafficking, increase sex workers and the men who use them and hurt them by having some very easily simple conditions put in before you start recruiting like maniacs. So what else happens? So these are all the social issues that come with lack of housing. But there's something else that happens when you have a whole new bunch of homelessness. And I've seen this myself firsthand on PEI. What you have is a loss of humanity. Yes? A loss of humanity. It's one of the reasons I had to leave Vancouver, because I was so tired of watching people blindly walk over children, sleeping in doorways, walking over people passed out on the sidewalk. Yes, that person could be on drugs, and yes, that person could be a drunk, but yes, that person is a human being who has family and people who love them, and children, and friends, and yes, that person could be in the middle of dying. And you don't know if that person on the street are any of your assumptions. They could be someone who's just had a stroke, heat stroke, heart attack, fainted because their diabetes, their sugar levels are low. It could be anything. There's a growing number of children, youth, teenagers across Canada and the States who are literally dropping from coronaries. They have no idea why these healthy young adults that's happening to them, but it's a thing. So it could be someone's kid who's just dropped, and you go, oh, that disgusting, in your head, drunk, drugged up, no good, adolescent, juvenile delinquent, and that kid is dying. not too long ago, a friend, about a month and a half ago, a new friend asked me out for lunch. I was hot, and we crossed from the Confed Mall to a Taste of India. Lying on the street in the boiling sun was a man. He was dark. I don't know if he was Aboriginal or if he was from a different culture, but he was passed out. And I don't know for sure that he was drunk at all, but he was passed out in the middle of the sidewalk in the heat. And I watched people walk over him, walk around him, swear at him. I did not see one person, not one person, stop and say, "Are you okay?" That lack of humanity, that willingness to be blinded to the tragedy of others, and to allow that tragedy. Everybody who walked over that person, every person who walks over any child, any adult, any senior, because they're passed out and do not stop, are complicit in that person's fate. So if that person dies, every person who walked by without stopping is responsible for that death. I stopped, of course, because, well, my mother always said, if you see it, take care of it. It's not in my nature. It never will be. It never has been. To walk over somebody lying prone in the street. And I admit, I'm not as up on my game as I used to be because I missed a step. But I stopped and I shook the person very vigorously and very loudly say, "Hey bud, are you okay?" You know, he opened his eyes. He looked me in the eyes. He had very blue eyes, even though he was very dark, so I'm not sure where he was from. Although there are indigenous people who are very dark with blue eyes, so he could have been anyone. And he gave me eye contact and said, yeah, I'm okay. So we went for lunch. I should have called an ambulance to come and check him out. He responded he was alive. I didn't do that, but I should have called. And as I was sitting there having lunch, we could see the sidewalk. The police came up. I guess they moved him along. But I should have called the ambulance. And I kicked myself for not having done so. In Vancouver, I would have immediately called the ambulance because the police moved him on. But he had been lying in the hot sun. So by then, he could have had sunstroke or heat stroke. Do I know whether he's still alive? No. Did he end up in the hospital? Possible. Even likely. But what terrified me was how easily Islanders, the community of Charlottetown, have learned to be so indifferent to somebody else's tragedy that they would walk over a body, not even knowing if that body is a corpse, not caring enough to ask, not calling the police, not calling an ambulance, not stopping to offer water, to offer help, to... I was blown away that PEI had gotten to that state so very quickly. So I want to ask you, is this the type of society you want to raise your children and grandchildren in? Is this what you want to teach them? That, hey, that's not a human being lying on the ground. It's a thing. And we don't care about things. So, whether it's alive or dead, I don't know. We're not stopping. We have to go have lunch and we have to meet your Aunt Edna. Is that who we want to become on PEI? Is that the island? Is that the history, the new history we want to write for ourselves? Because that's what we are doing. And we are doing that by walking over people. But we are also doing it by being very silent about Clifford Lee being appointed housing advisor to the provincial government. I mean, I know I've talked to a number of islanders about it, and they're so used to this kind of patronage, cronyism, misogyny kind of behavior that they laugh at it. They go, well, it's kind of funny, isn't it? And kind of ironic. And I go, yeah, but what are you going to do about it? Oh, well, he's already been appointed. There's nothing to do about it. And I'm going, actually, that's not quite true. Because as citizens, we have a great deal of power. The government has convinced people that they're the ones with the power. But they're really not. We, the citizens, are the majority. There's only a few people up in those offices as opposed to the 100 odd 40,000 people that exist on PEI. 40,000 voices is a lot of voices. 15,000 voices are a lot of voices. Even 10,000 voices are a lot of voices. 5,000 voices are a lot of voices. 1 or 2 voices, yeah, not a lot. 100, 200, doesn't make a difference. And I haven't been hearing a massive outcry. I haven't been hearing a critical mass of voices going, you know what? Appointing Clifford Lee as housing advisor is an indignity that we shall not suffer. We shall not be treated as fools. We shall not be treated as morons. We shall not be treated as if we're too stupid to know that this was in the bag before he even decided not to run. How was he hired? What is his track record? What has he accomplished in housing on PEI to avert a housing crisis that makes him an advisor to the province on housing? He created this mess, and they're hiring him? The fact that he's been on council, I mean, he was a part of council and in government when I got here in 95 the first time, and he was still around in 2013 when I came back, 12 years later. So he's been a part of this whole process of creating the housing crisis. So why are people not up in arms? Why are people not pitching tents in the government building grounds and going, you know what? We're not moving until something's done. And not the poor, because the poor and the people in income assistance are terrified. Not scared, not a little afraid. They are terrified. So whatever happened on PEI in terms of government between 2001 and 2013 and now, people weren't terrified in 1995 when I got here. They felt that they had rights and had value. People are terrified. Mind you, it also doesn't help that the government is not following the law. And that law is that if you have legislation, that legislation has to be available. It has to be accessible. Well, legislation on income assistance, for example, is only on the website in an abridged format. So the regulations and the act are incomplete, especially the act. It is incomplete. And there's a little note going, go to the Queen's Printer, blah, 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 the Royal Gazette, and their copy is abridged. So the act that is online, it deals with the lieutenant governor's responsibility, the minister's responsibility, and the director's responsibility. And that's where it stops. The whole section on the responsibility of the the income assistant workers, the supervisor, the provincial supervisor, the what money is available, for what uses they are available, what are there's always what's the word I'm looking for? Whenever there's a rule, there's always exceptions to the rule. That whole component on individual rights and responsibilities and the rights and responsibilities of the worker towards the individual on assistance are not to be found on the government website anywhere. I have not found them. I have asked for them to be emailed to me. I have asked for a copy of them. I have not received them. So people are terrified because, as far as they're concerned, if they speak up, the full power rests with income assistance to arbitrarily cut them off, cut off their housing, take away their children, blacklist them, which is not a great word, but it so applies in this context. So they're terrified. So the ones who would be able to read the jargonese of the ministry can't find and aren't getting the full act. The act is not easily accessible. People don't know what they're entitled to or their rights. A lot of income assistant workers do not offer that information. It's like a work culture assumption. And it's not just PEI, this is across the country. Workers do not volunteer any information about what you're entitled to. And in fact, after reading the Act and writing extensive notes and hearing stories from friends, a lot of the income assistant workers have not read the Act thoroughly, do not remember the Act, and automatically tell people, no, we don't do that. No, you can't have that. When in fact, the Act states, yes, a person can have that. So people on income assistance or who are poor and have children or are out of work or on EI or are immigrants who don't know the rules or refugees who come from very dangerous places where the politicians and the police are dangerous, they're freaking afraid. So the people with the voice, who should be speaking out, who always bitch and complain about their taxes going to those useless bums who don't want to work, which is not true, they're the ones who complain but don't speak out. They're not a critical mass speaking out to the government saying, how the hell? Look, I supported you and I contributed to your campaign. How the hell is it that you've hired Clifford Lee as an housing advisor when we have a housing crisis and I have panhandlers in front of my store all the time? I'm not hearing a lot of those voices. Those are the voices with clout. The lower middle, the middle, and the upper middle class people. Not to mention the ones who are making money off of all the poverty. So those critical voices, that critical mass, is deadly silent. And so that silence is consent for the situation we're in. and it's condoning the government's mishandling, both provincially and municipally, of the lives, well-being, and health of every citizen, every child, and every senior. So as long as we are silent, we are saying, yep, it's okay to do that. Yep, it's okay to have homeless. It's definitely okay to walk over people and not give a shit if they're dying. Because let's assume they're some drunken Indian, or they're out of control teenager, or instead of saying, maybe this person has heat stroke, or maybe this person is suffering a cardiac arrest, or maybe this person fainted in the heat. I should check, because that's the humane thing to do. It's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to teach our children. It's the right thing to role model. Do we want to be Vancouver? Well, we're already there. As soon as rents went up and food went up to in a way that people can't afford to eat and can't afford to live in safety, we became Vancouver. And as soon as people walk over people who are lying in the streets without caring whether they're alive or dead, we have become Vancouver, Los Angeles, any big city in another country where, there's volunteer tourism for the poor, but our own poor are like not worth it. So let's talk a little bit more about Clifford Lee and his boondoggle destruction of Charlottetown based on stupidity, ignorance, the unwillingness to do any research, which is at everybody's fingertip on Google, the indifference towards the community and the needs. Transportation. It's another issue that really does tie into homelessness. Transportation. So, when I first got to PEI in the middle of a snowstorm in February of 1995, and a couple of days later asked somebody on the street, so where can I get the bus, please? And the woman, I'll never forget her, she patted my hand and said, no, no, dear, we don't have any buses. And I said, no, really, I'm tired. I need to go home. Where's the bus stop? No, no, dear, we really don't have any buses. And then I found out, what? PI doesn't have any buses. And everybody said, oh, it's because of this, because of that, because of the other. And I went, oh, that's so much bullshit. Because in Ibiza in 1969, when people didn't even have TVs, there was almost no home phones. And if you lived in the country, you didn't have running water. A lot of fincas had dirt floors. But they had a very comprehensive bus system. A very, very good bus system, even out in the country. But the downtown bus system on an island smaller than PI, with far less money and far less resources, had a really good bus system. So in 1995, the whole, well, we don't have enough riders and blah, 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 blah. I thought, you guys are delusional. But a bus system was put in. And it's dysfunctional. And because there is a lack of vision, and a lack of thought, and a lack of planning, and a lack of reading best practices, which I have done, I pulled off 4 or 5 major and minor cities' best practices for having a bus system that is both competent, workable, and also conscious of safety and pedestrian safety. PI has none of that. And people here, I heard a bus driver say, oh, I've seen people fall and they've hurt themselves. And of course, the people who fall and hurt themselves on PI, there's an attitude, so they don't sue the city and they don't sue the bus company. They go away with their injury, and whether they're injured for life, they don't do anything about it. So when the buses were, I think it's what, 15 years now, something like that, 12, 15 years, when the city decided to put in and actually have a functioning bus system, what they did not do, which you don't have to be a city engineer, you don't have to have a PhD, you don't have to even know anything about city planning, none of that stuff. It's just basic reasoning, logic, and what's rational, is to put in infrastructure. And no, the Charlottetown may not have been able to put in all the bus infrastructure as soon as they did the buses, but they could have staggered it. They could have ensured that each summer when they did road work and sidewalk work, that they took some of that grassy area and that part of the sidewalk out to make pullouts for the buses. It's very basic. First of all, letting people off in the middle of the street is really dangerous, because if you have a mobility issue, you can fall and hurt yourself. That's one thing. Second of all, stopping in the middle of a busy street like University Avenue and having traffic pile up behind you because of our tourist season and the hundreds and thousands of people who come to visit us, and the backlog and the small streets and the lack of upgrading and the lack of upgraded infrastructure means that on top of the construction that happens in the middle of summer and the buses stopping in the middle of the road, we have a ridiculous amount of traffic backup that is unnecessary. A good case in point is the main bus stop on Grafton Street by the Confed Center. So the city didn't want to lose those parking spaces. So that main bus stop is actually not accessible to the bus. And when there's a bus dropping off and picking up people on that particular street, because there's nowhere for the buses to go, they actually are in the middle of the street. And you have to get off the bus and walk all the way around the bus across traffic to get on the other bus if you're transferring. And traffic is backed up in both directions because the buses straddle the yellow line. And yet there's a bus stop, and it should have been totally cleared of car spaces so that the bus could actually pull up to the bus stop like is normal in every other city in Canada, let alone in other parts of the world that are poor as hell but have really good bus systems. So, Clifford Lee is also responsible, him and City Council, for putting in a bus system that is semi-functional. It still doesn't run enough, but is totally non-functional, especially from May until October and beyond, when we're at the highest capacity of people. Road construction happens, and unlike any other city, big or small, on PEI there's a monopoly on who does the construction and how much they get paid. And so, like other cities, they don't do nighttime construction in non-residential areas, which every other city, and I've driven across the country 4 times, so I've seen a lot of this. Other places who have high traffic and narrow roads, and there's non-residential areas, don't do construction at peak hours, like rush hour in the morning, rush hour after work. But they do work into the night, late, and sometimes they work all weekend to get the job done and get it done properly. PEI is not there. Charlottetown still thinks it's a small town. So it has small town attitude that is even more backwards than small town attitudes of 1969, 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000. It's 2018, and PEI does not have basic infrastructures so that Trias Transit can operate more safely. And it would have been cheaper when the buses first came into play if Clifford Lee and his cronies and city council had put in staggered construction for infrastructure for bus stops. So, another thing that PEI just laughs at and go, oh well, it's PEI. You know, that might have been okay in 1980 and 1990 and 1995, but in 2018, when there is so much information, so easily accessible, where with a click of a on Google, I can go into Google Scholar or anywhere else and find out about best practices around avoiding a housing crisis, best practices for pedestrian safety, the responsibility of city and bus and construction to make it safe for pedestrians. What not to do in terms of creating a housing crisis and traffic crisis and learning how to destroy our own humanity through indifference. I think Clifford Lee and City Council have a lot to answer to, as well as all of us, because our silence, well, not mine, I'm always outspoken, you guys know this. Well, the guys who know me who are watching this know that I'm always saying, look, there's a problem, but I'm short, black, poor, middle-aged, and yeah, I don't have the power, I don't have the voice, I don't have the money, I don't own the property, so I'm not listened to. Visionaries never are. But Clifford Lee, you know, I begged when they were doing, anyway, I would do his job for free. For free. Because BC had some programs available, not enough, and that's why they have serious issues. But what is PEI going to become with the housing crisis? Like, PEI has never had tent cities or shanty towns. So how are islanders and the city police going to react when people and their children and their elderly mothers put up tents because they have nowhere else to live, and you can't live in a car very comfortably, you can't cook in a car? So what are they going to do? Are they going to follow Chilliwack? Does anybody remember Chilliwack? Well, a few years ago, I think was I on PEI or in Halifax? Anyway, Chilliwack, the Chilliwack police, in its infinite wisdom, and because the average citizen complained about the disgusting homeless people, rather than going, we are all responsible for the housing crisis, how are we going to fix it? No, they went, move them along, we don't want them in our neighborhood. And so what the Chilliwack police did was to spray all the tents and all the belongings, all the possessions, what very few of these people had, including blankets and knapsacks and um, sleeping bags, with liquid chicken shit. That's what they did. They thought that was a good solution to to treat people like that. They sprayed them, they sprayed their belongings. There was a bit of an outcry after that happened, and then, of course, everybody forgot it. I did not forget it because it was the most horrific thing I had heard. It was the most inhumane thing I had heard. And I could not understand how any one person could do something like that and not see the wrongness. To me, doing stuff like that is true evil. To me, walking over people on the street, not doing anything about it, not caring, not raising our voices, it's inhumane. But I also think that hunger and lack of housing, that the governments of the day, whether city or provincial, should be charged with crimes against humanity. Because housing and food are not luxuries. They are necessities. So, the questions I'm going to leave you with is, individually, how are you going to help to change the situation? How are you going to actively raise your voice, whether by writing to the province, writing to the city, calling city council, calling the Minister of Social Services and Housing, calling the Premier, if you're on first name terms with him, asking him, what the fuck are you doing, Wade, old boy? Because this isn't the kind of place I want to raise my children and my grandchildren and my grandchildren's grandchildren. This is not what I bargained for. This is not the PEI that I grew up in, and it's not the PEI in Charlottetown that I want to live in the future. So what are you going to do individually to actively be a part of the change? And what are we going to do collectively with the critical voice to let the province know that this is unacceptable, that the lack of enough funding for people on assistance, the lack of housing, the lack of safe housing, the fact that because of this housing crisis and how really fast immigration, when that happens really fast, you get what I call enclaves. So you start to get where the Ghanaian and Nigerian people live, and you have where the Middle Eastern people live, and you have where the Asians live, and that kind of division, that kind of lack of connection and community and support and involvement and civic engagement, because it's all white, let's face it. City council is all white. I'm not holding my breath that even if more women get in, that there's going to be any diversity. Because, well, that's a whole different thing. I'll say that at the end. But the question now is, what are we going to do collectively to get Clifford Lee out as housing advisor? Because he has no track record. He has created the housing crisis. He has been a fundamental part of it. So your taxpayers and mine, even though I'm not working, whenever I buy panty liners, toilet paper, cleaning products, whatever it is that is not a food item that is exempt, I'm paying taxes. So as far as I'm concerned, regardless of whether you make money or you don't make money, every time an islander wipes their ass, they're paying taxes. And those taxes pay the government. The government is essentially our employees. Council is essentially our employees. So when are we going to stand up and go, we've had enough? No more, not happening, we're done. So how are we going to do that together? That's my question, because I can't do it alone. I've spoken up, I've written, I've talked, I'm dismissed. I don't have the clout. But business owners, people who own property and have a social conscience, people who own businesses and have a social conscience, people who are just rich because they inherited and have a social conscience. Your voices are what will make the difference, because everybody else is too afraid. That fear is real. So like I said before in my introductory podcast, if I suddenly have a hit and run accident or pushed into or die from a weird freak accident, yeah, I'm betting big business and the government will have done away with me. I might even be the first assassinated podcaster on PEI. But let's hope not, because I haven't seen my grandchildren in 3 years and I really want to see them again. So, think about this, please. Think about the kind of city and province you want your children and your children's children and yourself as a adult and a senior to live in. And does that include inhumanity? So, my couchmate, who, like I said, is homeless because her apartment's turned into our Airbnb. And for those of you who do not know me, I have a really small one-bedroom apartment. But we're functioning. I couldn't live with myself as a person and throw her out and the cat, Princess Callie Kitty, out on the street, regardless of what my health is. I couldn't live with myself. Literally. I could not live with myself. I rather die than become indifferent and inhuman. But anyway, my roommate Cindy, she kind of was disappointed in how I signed off on my podcast, my last podcast last night. So I'm signing off differently. And that is for all the community Paladin warrior healers, go out, create change, raise your voice, because together we make a difference. As individuals, when we speak, we make a difference. So go out there. Think about the kind of human being you are. Think of who you want to see reflected in the mirror. And then go out there. The warriors, the healers, the Paladin warrior community healers, go out, go forth, and create the change. Stephanie Douglas, signing off for tonight. Hi. So this is the second half of my introduction. It was supposed to be all one piece, but learning curve, I thought I could pause and resume recording, but for some reason it didn't let me do that, and I haven't figured it out, but I will. So I ended the first half of my introduction by saying I was the eldest at home, and that's true. This part of the podcast, I want to give another example of when I realized that I was a moral being for the first time, and how that has brought me to here to a podcast called A View from Abroad. And actually, the title is one that I started using in 1996 when I was taking the Holland College journalism program, and we had to have our own opinion column. And I called mine A View from Abroad, which had a lot of eyebrows raising. However, since 1998, I've worked in papers in on PEI, the West Prince Graphic, in Marysville, Washington State, the Marysville Globe. I've worked for the Mountaineer in Central Alberta, Rocky Mountain House, and I've worked for the Coast Reporter in Seashelt. I've also freelanced for Windspeaker and for Sweetgrass, and I used to volunteer for the Atlantic Cooperators. So I've been using A View from Abroad for a long time. So the second time when between 7 and 8.5, the first time I realized I had a responsibility, a duty. My mother's teaching that she did not know how to use. None of my siblings got it, but it became the core of who I am, and that is the duty to protect those who are vulnerable, who cannot at that moment protect themselves, whether that's child, vulnerable populations, dogs, cats. It runs the whole gamut. So my mother, who was from Los Angeles and in LA in 1962 when I was born, having a half black child was very, very rare still. And funny enough, on my birth certificate, the hospital staff could not wrap their heads around the fact that my mother was white, having a black child, so they listed my mom as Negro. My mom was brilliant and totally crazy, fucked up, and dysfunctional. In other words, more than the acronym FINE, which stands for fucked up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. She was all of those things, but also narcissistic and agoraphobic, among others. But she was brilliant. She had a grade 8 education, and our house was full of the classics. And we had 4,000 books when we left Ibiza in 1979, accumulated over almost 11 years. And I had read a very big chunk of all those books. Everything from Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Charles Dickens, Herman Hesse, Erich Fromm, to Little Women, Black Beauty, the real Black Beauty, not the abridged Disney version. The real Black Beauty is an amazingly beautiful, sorrowful, one-of-a-kind book. Wuthering Heights, Pride and Prejudice, the list is endless. When you read a lot, even when I started reading around 8, I was a late reader, but I got right into books. You learn a lot, and my mother had learned mega much. And one of the things she used to talk to us was about our moral responsibility and what ethics were, and the human rights movement in the States, and friends of hers, you know, never coming back. And she always maintained that she was on the march to Selma, Alabama. She had friends among the Black Panthers. That is true because I met them and there's pictures, or there were pictures. But always the message was protect those who are younger, who are littler, who are more vulnerable. So when I was about 8.5, I was walking home from school, and there was this abandoned kind of courtyard where a building had been demolished. And in it was this boy who was, well, he was a gypsy boy, blonde and blue-eyed. He was still a gypsy boy, around 12, 13. And he was trying to string up a dog. Now, the most common dogs in Ibiza, and ones that I love, and would love to have one day, are called Podencos Ibicencos. And they're a very specific type of breed. And this one was, I don't know how old it was. I didn't really look at the age of the dog. But this 13-year-old boy was trying to string him up. And I kind of knew him peripherally because he lived in the neighborhood. And I had a split second, literally, to decide what to do. A split second. I think there's a movie by that name. But it was a split second. And in that split second, I went, if I try to find somebody to help, I may not find anybody for a while who thinks this is important. Because back then, the church said dogs have no souls. And so at that time in Ibiza, dogs could not feel pain because they had no souls. It was an attitude that was changing as more and more people had dogs as pets. So if I tried to find somebody, the dog could be dead. If I ran home to try and get my mother, the dog would definitely be dead. The only choice, and I could walk away and just pretend I didn't see it. But the only choice for me, the only choice that made sense, was to go in fighting. And so I fought this bigger boy, and I got hurt, but I got the dog loose and away and saved the dog. And let me tell you this, when you're about 8, 8.5, and you've been kicked in the groin, vagina, all that area, by a much bigger boy with very knobby knees, it hurts a lot. It fucking hurts. So I walked home bow-legged, and my mother put cold compresses on it, and she was proud of me that I had stood up. One of the things she taught us early is that when you stand up and speak out, you always run the risk of pain. And she would say that same message in different ways and more developed ways, broader ways, as I got older. But in that moment of deciding to go in and save the dog, I realized that I was a being who had to make my own moral choices of right and wrong, and that making those choices of right or wrong was going to be a daily thing of experiencing something or seeing something and deciding, what am I going to do about this? Am I going to speak up? Am I too afraid? Am I okay with getting hurt? Am I okay with dying? Because people who speak up, a lot of them end up dead, depending what country you're on or how influential you are. So if I ever end up dead by a hit and run, or somehow got pushed in the middle of a crosswalk, remember, it's probably the government who got rid of me. Or big business, one of the two. Anyway, from that point on, my life, I did lots of waitressing and cooking and working in clothing stores and running boutiques until I was in my mid-20s, about 25. And then I got this opportunity out of the blue to work with people with mental delays and mental, physical, and physical, severely physical challenged. And that was great because as a waitress, I took a long time with my customers because making money was never my biggest thing. It was sitting, having coffee for a few minutes with a man from Up Island. I was in Victoria. From Up Island, I can't remember where. I think it was Nanaimo or Qualicum or someplace like that, who was in a home in Charlottetown away from his family. He had had a stroke and did not speak very clearly. It was difficult to understand him unless you took the time to sit down, grab his hand, let him know that it didn't matter how long it took for him to say the words, I would listen. So waitressing became less and less and less satisfying because, well, when the owners are there, they want you to be hustling even if there's nobody there. The whole concept in the 80s in Canada was like, look like you're busy. If not, you're useless, even if there's nothing to be busy about. Definitely not the Spanish way. If it's busy, you work your ass off. If it's not busy, you sit down, you rest, you relax, you develop relationships with your coworkers. So from that time when I was 8, and I sometimes wonder, really, based on the core soul spirit of who I am, the teachings that I absorbed from my mother, um, whether and from philosophy, doing a BA with an honors in philosophy, um, and reading a lot about determinism and free will. Sometimes I wonder, did I actually make that choice for a tough life, for post-traumatic stress, from speaking out, from being honest in staff meetings when a team lead would say, this is our new project, how do you like it? I really want your feedback. I value your feedback. And I would give feedback. I would go, it's great. We could do this and this to make it better. And I never realized, I never got the fact that they did not want feedback. They just wanted people to agree that it was fantastic. I'm 56. I still haven't learned that lesson. But the fact is that whether it was semi-predetermined or free will, or a combination of multiple facets, free will, nurturing, education, determinism based on my decision to be an ethical human being, it set the pattern and the path of my life. And so all my life, since I was young and did volunteer work, and my first failed attempt at college because I had no support and I was a single mom, a black single mom with a baby in a homogeneous white community. I took sociology and psychology and all the interesting stuff that I thought at the time. So the question of whether there was free will involved, I think there was, but I also think that who I am at the core of my being is someone who has to speak up. I've always felt compelled to speak for those who are terrified of speaking up, whether the fear is real or perceived, that if they're on income assistance, that if they speak up, their children will be taken away, they'll be cut off benefits. Especially here in PEI, it's like, that's another podcast. Speak up for the waitress whose boss deducts the money from a grab and go. It's a thing in Vancouver where people eat their food and then they basically get up en masse and go when the waitress isn't looking. And actually doing that is illegal At least in BC, it's illegal. Um, and she couldn't tell her boss. She couldn't say anything. She was a single mom with a child. I had already been there. So I got to tell her boss, this is not legal. And you know what? If I complain again, you can get a $10,000 fine. And if I complain again, well, you see how it's going to go. So no more taking off money that you know you can't take off your staff checks, because it's called the cost of doing business, especially in the restaurant business. And I checked back there one day on my way home from UBC, went to have a beer, and asked if any more monies were being deducted for things that she had no control over. And no, they weren't. So I've learned that speaking up and actively doing things to create change do create change. One voice can be extremely powerful. However, when you are one voice, you're also easily dismissed unless you have power, unless you have money, unless you're white. Very hard to disregard people like that. People like me, I'm middle aged, I'm round, I'm brown, I'm opinionated. I speak up all the time and I let the government know exactly what I think. And I have complex post traumatic stress and chronic pain due to arthritis in pretty much everywhere, and a near death experience in 2014. So I'm not working, I am on income assistance. And yet, it hasn't stopped me from looking at injustices and speaking up, looking at gaps and speaking up, because for every person who does speak up, there are hundreds who are terrified to raise their voice. So as a journalist, I was very lucky when I worked in Rocky Mountain House, because I had a brilliant editor who was also part owner of the paper along with his twin siblings, a male and a female. They bought it from their dad. And he was kind, compassionate. Everyone loved him. He was a brilliant editor. He was conscious and aware and astute about the ills of the world. And he never curtailed me. In fact, rather than curtailing me, he broadened my world of journalism. He supported me in growing my talent. We had a 7-year plan. And then he died tragically and suddenly of a massive coronary. And that made me make new life decisions. One was going back to BC so I could visit my granddaughter. I only had one at the time, when her parents weren't mad at me and I was allowed to see my granddaughter. That's another post. Family and family dysfunctions. But I went back to BC because I thought, if I never see my daughter or my granddaughter again and I die tomorrow, that will be really hard on them. So I got a job at the Coast Reporter in Seashelt, Sunshine Coast, close to Gibson, where the Beachcombers were made. And it was an okay job. I did some really good writing about some very complicated issues with the regional council there. I was able to really spend the time, I was allowed to spend the time needed to develop relationships with the members of 3 reserves of 3 different nations, because it's a process. I may be dark like them, and they may be able to identify with me, but I was also a reporter, and reporters are very distrusted because of how skewed and how one-sided and how one-dimensional their stories are in most weeklies and dailies in Canada about Aboriginal life. They tend to focus on the issues rather than the commonalities, and I like to focus on the commonalities as well as the issues. I like the balance. And so, but in order to have that opportunity to do their stories and to do the balanced stories, it took a lot of time. They were 2 to 3 hours away from the office, the different reserves, and my boss let me drive up there and spend all day and knowing that I was not coming home with a story. I was building trust, I was building relationships. And so I got to do some amazing work. Once I got to the Sunshine Coast, I was still doing some pretty cool stuff. But my daughter, with her partner, whose parents are from Halifax, and he's originally from Halifax, decided to move to Halifax. And it was a really crappy situation. It wasn't working out. Their living arrangements with his parents, all the reasons why they went to the East Coast from the West Coast, at that point were not working out. And my daughter was calling me at work every day, telling me that she was going to leave her partner, that she was coming back to BC, that, things were breaking down, that she couldn't cope with where she was living, she couldn't cope with the people. And one day I just said, "Do you need me to come?" And she said, "Mom, I need you to come." And I sent off lots and lots of resumes to all the different newspapers, not just in um, Nova Scotia, but in New Brunswick and PEI. But I knew that once I hit the East Coast, my journalism career was over. Because out here, there's not really very many, almost none, independent weeklies, dailies. It's very, very, very conservative. The writing, the media, it was better in the 90s. It's become very status quo, very one-dimensional, not a lot of voices in each story, and um, all the print media on PEI is all white. All of it. All white journalists. Not only is it all white journalists, some of the journalists have been doing journalism on PEI for 20, 30 years. Sometimes, maybe even more than that. So, dealing with a near life death experience and having a compromised immune system and there being a lot of crappy politics going on and having no money has really meant a frustration of also feeling like I had no voice. Although I would write things on Facebook extensively about where PI and Charlottetown were going, trying to raise the alarm, trying to raise public consciousness that we were headed for a housing crisis, which we're in right now. Um, Offering information and knowledge for free. Um, it's amazing how much free is not valued. So I'm a diversity specialist. I've been working in diversity, around diversity, for diversity, and with diversity, and being diverse all my life, but working in it since 1984, when I volunteered at the Victoria Intercultural Association. I've been doing this a long time. They say after 10 years you're a specialist. I've been doing it like 37, 38 years. In work-wise, volunteer-wise, living it for 56 and a half years. I'm a specialist on diversity, and I'm really good at it. Um, However, there's no place for me on PI in that area. There's no place on PEI for me as a journalist. And with the post traumatic stress that was severely triggered when I ended up on life support, that's another story. Life support for a week, critical care for a week, and recovery for a week. Um, and the physical chronic pain associated with arthritis in my neck, my shoulders, my joints, my rib joints, my back rib joints, my first joint, my knees, my ankles. Yeah, I'm a mess. But finding a workplace that can be flexible for the days when I'm really triggered or having anxiety attacks or am in too much pain to move, it's really, really, really hard to do. And I've been considering restarting a consulting company I had in Halifax, which I developed through a self-employment program after my program at the largest settlement organization on the East Coast um, decided that I had spoken up one too many times, and when there was some funding cuts, my program and my position, I was the only person whose program and position were cut. So I started my own consulting business, essentially doing the same thing, which was delivering workshops to employers across Nova Scotia on cross-cultural communication, recruitment, retention, engagement in community, um, and all those kinds of things. Again, on PEI, you have to build up, and you have to have some capital. And even though I've offered every political party on PEI, and I've offered all municipal candidates across PEI, municipal elections happen in November, free, totally free diversity workshops on how to engage diversity, the most marginalized people, um, as being part of their campaign team, indigenous people as being part of the campaign teams from the beginning, how to engage diversity, how to get the votes from the diverse community, from new Canadians, sorry, and get new immigrants involved in the process so that when they do become citizens, they have an understanding of the political process, which is important because the most diverse a group is, the more diverse councillors on a city council are, the more diverse a provincial government is, a federal government is, the better the problem solving skills. And civic engagement creates a sense of knowledge, participation, and that what happens politically affects all of us, regardless of our income. And we get more awareness of that. So I've been frustrated. None of those things that I thought might pan out ever felt really, really right until this last week. And I owe that all to my couchmate. So this is another podcast, Charlottetown's housing crisis. But my friend Cindy, her apartments, when her landlord died, his son decided to evict everybody and turn them into Airbnb. And one bad experience was an older couple in the country, and she was basically homeless. And I told her that she could stay with me. I have a tiny one-bedroom apartment, tiny kitchen, and it's so tiny, the bathroom's so tiny, it only has a tiny little shower stall. Actually, you can sit on the toilet, brush your teeth, wash your face, put on moisturizer, and never get off the toilet. You can reach everything from the toilet, which is good, if you fall asleep on the toilet, which I have done with sleeping pills, and woken up with my head balanced against the wall. At least I didn't fall over. But anyway, I told Cindy that she could stay with me until she found safe, affordable housing. And Cindy is pretty brilliant in so very many ways, and astute, and creative, and she's a pretty awesome human being. And one of the things she did for me while she's been here is she really explained what podcasts do and how podcasts can reach people and the value of it and the value of having a voice, the value of having long conversations, of interviews for as long as you want, the value of getting of a medium where knowledge can be shared. Because I have a lot of knowledge and I have a lot of skills, but knowledge and skills are only valuable if they can be shared. Because, yes, having certain knowledge gives me certain abilities to self advocate, and that's a certain amount of power in a powerless situation. However, that knowledge is no good to me unless I can share it with others, and others hear it and are able to identify from it, learn from it, use what fits into their lives, disregard the rest with a grain of salt. But it's also a medium by which people can engage. They can engage with me, and hopefully they will engage with louder voices, more collective voices, actively within the community to right some of the wrongs that are happening right now on PEI. It's a journey. I see this podcast as a journey that I am not taking alone. It's a journey with every listener, every person who comments, every person who agrees or disagrees. It's a journey. And my whole life has been a journey. My whole life has been a journey of trying to be the best that I can be, given what I have it in the moment. And that's where a lot of us are. We're all, I think, no matter how polished we think we are all works in progress as long as we're alive. Or we should be, because if not, we're basically the walking dead. Only we don't dribble blood and say brains, brains, brains. But basically, brain dead. So, this is the end of the second half of my introduction. It was longer. I touched on more things. But I hope the main message you get is I want to share knowledge that will support you, that will give you new tools in your toolbox, that will give you knowledge of where information is kept so that you can do your own self-advocacy, knowledge to take a stance and either be the fighter for justice or be the person who takes advantage of those least able to fight them off. A journey of discovery, of laughter. I intend to have all sorts of mediums on here, podcasts, video, interviews, everything from the housing crisis in Charlottetown and across Canada to magic and favorite foods and comfort foods and recipes and the memories that come with food and how do you use food to nurture and show love to the people in your life. So it's a journey that is new to me, this medium, but where I intend to give voice to the things, to the issues of today that are solvable but they are only solvable if we do it together and we journey together and we collectively act. Act. Not just listen, not just write a Facebook post about how horrible the situation, but act. Whether that's by protest, whether that's by writing letters to your MP, your MLA, the premier, the different ministers, there are all ways to act. Whether you decide to do a podcast interview of somebody I might have missed around the housing crisis, or the lack of infrastructure that PEI has put in. Who knows? But it's a journey I hope you take with me. This is very, very exciting time of my life. I have a wide open spectrum in front of me to learn, to grow, to change, to develop, and to share. I'm looking forward to sharing it with you and for you to share with me, because it's a mutual learning process. Thank you, and you will hear shortly from me, Stephanie Douglas, of You From Abroad.